welcome back. This is episode 3 of our long-form shuffle retrospective review. You can click the iCard for the playlist with all the parts, or go down below to read the entire review via Mel's blog tab. Last time we spoke on episode 12, 13, plus Asa and her role in the early stages in the plot. Now then, to episode 15, What Was Regained. For now we're going to forgo discussing episode 14 for a minute, as with its advent we mostly have all the pieces we need to talk about Narine's character as a whole, so let's put that aside for a moment. Episode 15 of Shuffle is in an interesting position, as by standard narrative conventions it is the climax of the story. Logic follows that everything afterwards should be falling action, but as anyone who's watched the show knows, this is far from the case. The plot loosely revolves around the gang of Rin, Sia, Nerine and Kaide, and in a sense Lycoris, Narine's dead clone sister twin, going to rescue Primula from the demon world. I say rescue, but really it's more like a hospital visit that turns into a retrieval. The actual plot is fairly simple all in all. Primula's condition suddenly worsens and threatens a repeat of the first experiment's catastrophic meltdown. Meanwhile, Rin, with assistance from Lycoris, helps Primula feel loved, and in doing so, saves her and everyone else present. From Primula's perspective, we see a cross between her introspective consciousness and flashbacks, along with some interesting sunflower field imagery. Breaking all this down opens us up to some dense symbolism, as I'm a rank amateur in terms of cinematography. There are also definitely better suited people to analyse these scenes. Nonetheless, I can't find anyone else doing so I shall do my utmost to fill in this role. At the very first scene of the episode, it's a short clip of a dragon-like creature swooping across the screen before a cut to some forest and our gang of heroes. The scene is by no means superb, but still impressive to look at, and works on a few levels. For one, it's an example of the show's many shuffle points. Based on its own namesake, the show frequently changes the tone or direction via an aesthetic, often short-lived, art style change. This is definitely one of those, and overall the moment works on 3 distinct levels. Firstly, for the casual audience, it communicates that we've left the realm of Earth. It's an obvious assumption, but also a well-made one. Had we just cut to the gang walking through the forest, you could conceivably mistake it for somewhere like the Amazon. Instead, the dragon clues in anyone who may have missed the previous episode or who is simply not paying enough attention that this isn't Kansas anymore. Secondly, it works as some small world building. Aside from flashbacks and cutaways, we spend very little time in the demon world other than in this specific episode, so using the opportunity to show us a completely detached location that helps flesh out this world is a nice touch, and I always appreciate the extra effort put into small details like this. Finally, however, is the aforementioned shuffle point. By showing this as our first scene of the episode, in an episode that specifically decides not to include the usual opening title song, the tone is immediately set that this episode is going to be a departure. Prominently gone is the somber tone of the previous 3 episodes, replaced with one of a quest, an adventure, in an unknown land. Note how the dragon and surrounding area come across as hostile secondary, but primarily as awe-inspiring, a massive world which shows might be content to explore in great detail. With this, we're prepared for a fight and a triumph, because episode 15 is a reward for Rin. He criticises himself in monologues, becomes depressed, and then took responsibility for the actions he's taken. With help from Asa, as represented brilliantly by the double entendre red ribbon she gifts to Rin, he's learned from his mistake, made a decision based on what he believes is best for Primula, and done his best to take Narine's feelings into consideration as well. It's also another example of Shuffle harnessing its animation medium. To capture a 5-second shot like this in live action would be incredibly expensive, from the vivid colours of the set pieces palette, including the blue sky and bright canyon, to creating a dragon that isn't just a CGI monstrosity. Replicating the tone this achieves in live action would be no small feat. Well, of course you could communicate something similar in a book format. Words often don't have such an ability to rapidly bombard the audience with such intriguing, rapid-fire imagery. It should suffice to say that I appreciate these opening moments a lot. Moving on, there's plenty to talk about, from the kings who break convention and simply let our heroes pass, to morally bankrupt scientists and a surprisingly epic or grandiose battle-style scene. But for now, let's hone in on Primula's involvement throughout. As I said at the top, she displays an internal struggle throughout the whole arc, as portrayed by the White Void, which was once her room, and barren, rainy fields, alongside sunflower-filled meadows. Some great imagery, and to talk proper about it, let's first address Shuffle's motif and use of colour. Colour motif. It should be obvious to the most casual of casual viewers that Shuffle indulges in the usual anime candy-coloured hair scheming, and while it's in no way unique, I think how Shuffle uses it in its character designs and storytelling is pretty interesting. First off, there's the hair colours. It's worth noting that they nicely match the characters who wear them. Kaide, the most human, is ginger. It's very bright, but that's kind of standard in anime. See Lieutenant Matilda for an early example from the 70s, 80s. Rin has brown hair and a dark green hue to his colour palette. Meanwhile, Asa initially seems flamboyant, but by the end of the series, her hair colour makes sense. Then we have Sia's crimson and Narine's magenta, representative of their otherworldly nature, the fact that they aren't human and certainly don't act like it. This actually extends to the side characters in a fun way too. Itsuki is a human, and his hair shows this in its standard chestnut brown coloration, also matching his uniform design too, which is a nice detail. Mayumi is a half-demon, and her design gives that off. She's short with discoloured eyes and a darker hair tone, almost imp-like features translated into a cute girl design. Finally, there's Kareha, ooh la la, an actual god. She's got long blonde hair tied in petite ribbons, a pale skin and a tall build, almost fairy or angel-like. She might even be described as elf, further aided by her frequent comical glowing in the more light-hearted scenes. Aside from these nice considerations in character design, the colour motif goes further, invading the OP, the title logo and the story. For example, almost every third line of my notes seems to mention some use of lighting to represent the character's feelings or emotional state, and this goes doubly if not triply for Primula. Due to her reserved nature, even near the end of the show, the bulk of her emotional communication is simply done with lighting changes, often reflected off her deadpan expression. But in the Awakening arc, we see it used further. Unlike is usually conventional, Primula's internal world is far from black. Instead, it's a pitch white room with the white and absence of colour, representing her loneliness and isolation. Primula herself is even lit a little bit brighter in most of these scenes to further increase her appearance's closeness to the colour white. After all, Primula's design in terms of colour is grey, a shadow of colour, but with two red ribbons tied into ponytails, indicative of the brief moments of love she's felt throughout her life. The white in her room, or cell even, is drowning. There's no real borders, no way in or out, just the endless sea of nothing until Lycoris appears. With Narine's signature magenta hair colour, her very presence alone illuminates the room and brings life to Primula's brief existence. We see this more throughout, but hopefully this short segment has helped to communicate the importance of the show's use of colour, within and outside its character designs. Talk about Lycoris. Something interesting that I only realised in this specific rewatch of Shuffle is how I've never actually questioned the legitimacy of Primula's relationship to Lycoris, or that of any of the characters for that matter. I'm a bit of a stickler for this thing if you've read my other stuff. It wasn't until over halfway through its third series that I bought into the relationship of Stephen Moffat's Sherlock Holmes and Watson, and by then that was far too little too late. Shuffle is a masterful way of characterizing its cast in small but meaningful ways. Take Itsuki, Mayumi, Rin and Kaide. We're told they've all attended school together for some time, but the show isn't content with just that, instead displaying it in small ways, how well they each know each other. For example, in Omelette of Happiness, the four discuss each other's cooking with mixed levels of contempt based on clear, unseen prior experiences, or how Asa's physicality is in the form of an energetic wake-up slaps towards Rin, which helps to communicate their childhood friend closeness, or just the entirety of the character building in episode 11. Why all this matters is to help make the world feel more alive and feel more lived in, while also making our primary cast feel more realistic, and we see this again with Lycoris. Long before her brief on-screen stint, we see that Narine and Primula have something of an uneasy relationship. Narine refers to Primula as Rimu, but often in a hesitant manner. Meanwhile, Primula never replies in kind, and often ignores her completely. The audience should be compelled to wonder about this, seeing as one would initially think that there's some form of estranged sisters, Shin's bastard child maybe. However, with hindsight we come to understand that to Primula, Narine really is little more than a stranger, and for Narine, all her familiarity comes from the fact that she inherited Lycoris' feelings and memories of Primula, among other choice memories, including her vocal cords. This all matters because when Primula is finally confronted with Lycoris inside the dreamscape, for both her and the audience there is a sense of familiarity, as though we already know Lycoris, and that's because the show has been doing subtle groundwork since the beginning. It should also be noted that while Lycoris and Narine literally have identical clone cells, they are not the same person, with Lycoris being far more of a big sister character, a lot more outgoing and helpful. She's similar to Asa in that sense, which might be another reason for why the writer decided to have her exit stage left for the final part of this arc, though those parallels are by no means missed. Primula calls out to Lycoris as her sister It's 15 episodes of build-up that pull on the heartstrings and are a full payoff for a relationship we only get to see glimpses of. Returning to the sunflower scene, we see Lycoris walk off into the sunflowers, away from Primula, into an eternal summer, paradise, heaven, or even maturity. Whatever way you want to put it, leaving Primula behind. It's a place Primula can't follow her to, and it plays magnificently into a theme of neglect. Rin turns her away, and in a sense so does Lycoris. It's not to say that she does so deliberately, but by giving her life to Nerine, she in turn leaves Primula alone forever. Except Primula did try to follow her, by pursuing her, seeking out the boy Lycoris talks so fondly of, only for him to eventually betray her wishes as well. Of course, that means it's only appropriate that in the end it's neither Lycoris, Nerine or Rin who individually save Primula, but a combination of all three. Rin accepting his feelings and casting aside his illusions of what's right and wrong for a man. Nerine realising her wish to avoid loss was simply a cause of another form of losing, and Lycoris making good on her promise to be there for Primula. In just one episode, the show manages to completely and satisfactorily wrap up 4 character arcs in one go. This isn't to say they're done growing as people. It will be some time before Nerine and Primula truly show the signs of this growth, but to me that's how natural character development should be. In the meantime, Rin has a long ways to go. While he definitely develops in a piece of brilliant character writing, all he's really done is swap out his decision to follow the order of society and replaced it by simply following what Ossa told him to do. And the show is oh so aware of this. His arc does end here, and it's a fateful send-off. I've always loved how, without overshadowing the others' efforts, Lycoris is still the main player in this situation, helping Primula from both the outside and inside. To set the scene, despite our hero's best efforts, words simply aren't getting through to Primula, and her magic is going critical. The demise of our hero seems imminent and inevitable, until Lycoris, using the last of her consciousness, cancels out Primula's power, just long enough for Rin to reach her and snap her out of it. In this moment, Lycoris proves herself as the true older sister and guardian of the group. An internal adult version of her gets to say one true final goodbye to Primula before walking into the sunflowers one last time. To me, it's nice how this defies conventions. It isn't just the protagonist she's known for a few months calls to her, or that a memory of a lost one comes to her, but a combination of both, combined with the fantastical manifestation of Lycoris' will. It makes for a great set piece and a fitting finale, one that would set Shuffle far above most of its contemporaries in character writing and execution alone, but the show's got a lot more up its sleeve to come. For now, we'll leave episode 15 behind us, though you can be sure we'll soon revisit it when addressing episode 14 and Narine's character, as well as when we come back to revisit Primula's character study later on. As a final note, there's a nice prologue-esque scene, post the whole confrontation, whereby Rin gets to give Primula his jacket, allowing him to walk around in a tank top, accentuating his own figure, and acting as a nice visual metaphor for how he's accepting his emotions was far more manly than his stoic actions in episode 12, now rewarded by him talking down to the gods while looking like some sort of Chad bodybuilder. It's some pretty great stuff, but for now let's take a step back. Episode 14, and character study, Nerine. Despite Primula's low number of lines, Nerine is no doubt the story's most understated character. In fact, her role in the series' second half is more akin to that of a secondary supporting role than as a love interest, and that's with some good reason. First off, let's note how Shuffle likes to weave its storytelling into its character's personality. Well, some of this could be called coincidence. If it is, then it's the happy sort for sure. For example, Kaide, the girl who's happy as long as Rin is happy, waits for her turn in the spotlight the longest. Meanwhile, Primula, the least developed person, has the least romantic of the storylines. It's a nice touch, and you can even see it going one step further in the very layout of the show. Our first 2 arcs are based solely in fantasy, and are the ones most conveyed through metaphors. Sia's arc appropriately straddles the line between real-life schizophrenia or bipolar disorder and more fantasy jargon. And finally we have Kaide and Ossa, far more grounded in reality at the end of the story. It's no surprise that Narine's reserved nature lends her story to be overshadowed by that of those around her, but it's no less well written for it. While I could definitely see someone being disappointed in Narine's reduced role post episode 15, I personally find it wonderful how she gets the chance to develop and live her life for herself, rather than simply following blindly after Rin's daily shenanigans. The small snippets we see of her joining a club, continuing in her pursuits of the ultimate omelette, and having friends outside the main group are to me a multitude more rewarding than a gaggle of other harem anime that have the main guy and girl hook up, only to then have all the girls act as though this never happened. I'm staring at you, High School DxD, Infinite Stratus, Sword Art Online, etc. That's not to say she doesn't still pursue Reen, but she comes to do it as a secondary part of her life, more like a hobby, not as her whole focus for living. I have in my notes, you can pinpoint the exact moment that her heart breaks, in relation to the scene following Primula's rescue, wherein Rin and Narine return Os's ribbon, and I stand by that. In this moment, Narine once and for all stops living for Lycoris, and instead starts living for herself, just like her sister would have wanted. This conclusion links most importantly to the main themes explored through her and Sia's parallel characters: survivor's guilt and a lack of self-worth. Both Sia and Narine share these two hang-ups, but to different extents. Sia clearly has a bigger issue with her own self-worth, while Narine feels immense guilt in surviving in place of her sister. The two ideas are similar, but not quite the same story, one of the show's main through lines. Survivor's guilt. Narine's survivor's guilt is the crux of her story. Her purpose for coming to the real world and chasing Rin is purely out of perceived duty to fulfill Lycoris' wish. In a sense, she's got something of an imposter syndrome complex, going as far as to claim her ability to sing is stolen. As we've already discussed, while a young girl, Narine's power led her to be extremely ill. Lycoris, whose lifespan was limited to begin with, sacrifices herself to save Narine, but unbeknownst to everyone else, Narine acquires more than just a restored constitution. We can also infer that this guilt hangs over Narine for some time, till she finally decides the best course of action is to simply live life for Lycoris. Also infer that this guilt hangs over Nerine for some time, till she finally decides the best course of action is to simply live the life Lycoris always wanted. And in a heartbreaking fashion, Nerine actually gives this away a couple of times if one pays attention, but most particularly is when she asks Rin if she can start loving him even more. It initially comes off as an inconsequential confession. That is, until with hindsight, we understand that what she really means is that she's admitted both to Rin, us, and in no small way to herself, that she might love Rin personally, and not just because of the memories she inherited. It's an interesting principle, and clues us in that during the whole first arc, really up till the close of episode 15, Nerine is acting on behalf of an agenda, and not because of her own feelings. This all comes to a head in episode 14, and in an interesting one, as it takes the momentum of episode 13, seemed to have ended on, and converts that energy into a long, heavy dialogue session. The whole thing, for the most part, is just a conversation between Rin and Narine, set in the playground where Rin first met Lycoris, and most recently in episode 1, Narine. It's a little exposition heavy, but with cutaways to break up the visuals and Narine's emotional explanation, it works really well. The discussion comes off as necessary and mature, rather than just for the purpose of giving the audience new facts to mull over. We come to understand the lengths to which Narine has gone to live up to the life she gained, now seeing why she's so formal and princess-like, aside from her actual position. To a casual viewer, till this moment it might have seemed Narine's infatuation with Rin was built on some rather shaky ground of one encounter as a kid, but to Narine, he's the boy who made Lycoris' life a little bit brighter. She in a sense is living one of her sister's regrets out to on the other side, I love how this episode manages to deal with multiple deep-seated issues at once. For example, if you wanted to, you can interpret Lycoris' sacrifice as something more akin to an organ transplant, once again showing how the fantasy elements are really only there as some quality set dressing. Moreover, I've always loved the discussion on why the Demon Society uses clones and artificial people. It wasn't some cliche about them not being real people, or even an understandable but immoral stance like the ends justify the means. No, instead, they didn't not do it out of malice, but because no one would mourn the clones when they die. It's a fascinating idea, and it's made clear that Shin would rather not put anyone's life in danger. The morality is grey as heck, and I find that intriguing coming from the king of the demons and the king of the gods. Narine is the simplest of the characters we'll be examining, but I believe her theme of guilt, which links wonderfully with other characters like Asa and Rin, works brilliantly, and gives us a well-fleshed-out character despite her minimal on-screen presence. She puts it best herself. That's why I've decided to live as Lycoris. Let that part of her take over. To me, there's no better way her story could have ended. As already mentioned, for her to move on with her own life, to make new friends, have and lead new experiences, and grow to pursue love for her own causes. Narine's character is all about coming to accept and love yourself. Her arc ends with that line that in a sense started her story back when she first uttered something similar to it, but now it represents progress, not stagnation. So now I believe the feelings I have are my own. The Lycoris part of me has vanished, but my love remains. These feelings are mine and mine alone. From this point forward, my love is for you and not for someone else. So I might fall more in love with you. That is, of course, only if you'll let me. End of episode 3. I hope you enjoyed. Feel free to leave a like or press the subscribe button or a comment. And till the next one, thanks for watching.